a feeling I have about the field of organization development that we are now interested in culture, but I'm worried that the field evolved much more around what the psychologists want to call culture, which leads to measurement and surveys and all kinds of ways of trying to quantify culture, and loses the strength of looking at culture from a sociological, anthropological point of view, that it is this very dynamic, shape-shifting, perpetually evolving set of things that happens in relationships or in organizations that gets totally destroyed if we try to say, well, let's clump up a survey and define a few culture dimensions. Right now, engagement is a big one. You know, let's say engagement is an important part of culture, and let's go measure the hell out of it. And we'll show that some things we do increase engagement. Fair enough. And then we publish that as a culture study. That's the mistake, to believe that when you've shown a correlation between something that maybe leadership is doing, the program of the month, and you actually get on the next survey higher scores on the engagement measure, that you've then done something important about culture. I would say you don't have any idea whether you've done anything about culture. All you really know at that point is that you've improved the scores on your survey. So there's this big gap in my mind between these simplistic survey-based definitions of culture and what culture really is, which is more like some of you mentioned, it's the sum total of what you've learned, whether you're an individual or a small group or a company. Culture is what you've learned, and it's with you and inside you, and it's all over you. So to compartmentalize it into a few variables is really a big mistake.
Yeah, I might add that I think there's this risk that culture becomes sort of weaponized. It isn't a specific sort of set of dials that you can, you know, establish a baseline and then say we need to move XYZ dial to a, you know, higher or lower level. But that's part of what we tend to see, is that, you know, it gets sort of passed down from, you know, the board or the C-suite to OD or HR to do a culture study, and then let's prove that we've improved our culture. You know, the minute you said let's do a culture study, you changed your culture. But improvement is kind of a funny concept when it's something that is as diffuse and ubiquitous as it is. You change culture every time you hire somebody too. So I worry that it turns into yet another sort of metric that gets weaponized.
Well, before drilling into your provocative questions about measurement and IO psychology and all of that, let me ask a broader question about culture, which is, why is it so important? You mentioned how culture evolves. Does it evolve, or is it deliberately changed? Because often leadership will say, we don't have the right culture for what we're trying to do. So could you share your thoughts about whether culture evolves, or how do you change culture, or how difficult or easy is it to deliberately alter culture?
I think I'd like to start on that by saying what most of us don't pay enough attention to is the evolution of organizations or teams or whatever grouping we're talking about. that when someone, a founder, an entrepreneur, an impresario says, hey, I'm going to produce a new product or a service or something, I'm going to gather some people around me. Ken Olson, when I first encountered him at Digital Equipment Corporation, we're going to make computers eventually. That founder has a set of values and ways of doing things based on his or her own cultural history. And it's their imposition of those values on the people they gather around them, because they're only going to gather around them people who feel and think like themselves. And they get together and say, let's do this. They hire somebody, take Hewlett and Packard. They start with some products, they build a factory, and they're a big roaring success. And then 20 years later, we talk about the HP way. And when you say, what the hell is the HP way? It's their culture. And where did that come from? It came from the specific ways that Packard and Hewlett thought about things, their particular values, how they felt about how you should treat people, how products should be marketed. Everything that HP did or the digital did was the product of what the founders introduced and that worked in the environment. It's in that sense that culture is an accumulation of learning. Not any old founder can impose anything, because if it doesn't work, the company will never be visible. It'll fail early. But those companies that have succeeded can be traced in terms of their ways of doing things today. Their values is very much a function of how the founders started. Now, so if you're looking at the early foundation of a culture, you go to the early foundation of the organization. But now HP is a mature company. And why are they hiring Carly Fiorina at some point? Because somebody in that organization says, hey, there are some problems with the HP way. It's not working so well anymore. But the HP way is still a sacred cow. And there are some people who believe that they hired someone like Carly in order to literally disrupt some of the elements of what the HP way had become, to bring in a whole new set of values, because she was an outsider. She didn't necessarily play by the HP way rules. And so that shook up the culture and caused all kinds of changes. So now leadership in midlife is a completely different ballgame of changing the culture, evolving it to something new. Gerstner coming into IBM is being asked to fix us as a company. So he messes around, discovers that they've lost some of their original values, brings them back, and then in his book he says, I changed their culture. But what he actually did was he revived some elements of their culture. So in every one of these stories, you get a different view of what culture is and how you go about thinking about evolving or changing or improving. There is no general answer independent of company age or condition.
There was a question in the chat that has to do with race, gender, ethnicity, in terms of how that relates to culture. Can either of you say a few words about that?
Well, it relates differently at every stage of the organization. For first point, just to put a period on my diatribe, you cannot answer that question in relation to culture. You can answer it in terms of a particular organization at a particular stage and the culture it has at that point in its history. Does that make sense to you? To rephrase the question that way. Right now, a lot of companies apparently believe that they are stuck with too homogeneous a set of people. So they want diversity. But that's related to the business problem, that they believe that more diversity will produce better innovation or better results. So the culture question is contingent on the business problem that they're trying to fix with diversity. And to call that a culture issue is to ignore that there's a reason why it's an issue, namely that the business isn't performing the way they think it ought to be, and they think that diversity and inclusion somehow will affect that in a positive way. That's my short answer. But I think we should give Peter a shot at how he looks at this same question.
Well, I guess I go back to that simple definition of accumulated shared learning. And so if you see some sort of synergy because you're hiring people from different countries or from different educational traditions or different religious traditions, then diversity and inclusion is, an intrinsic benefit to the business, because you have your intention is to create some sort of cultural synergy. If you're just creating cultural diversity, I mean, that may in itself be valuable, but what's the theory of why you're doing it? If you just say the accumulated shared learning is going to be bigger and richer, and we're able to create some cultural synergy by bringing different different races, different genders, different gender associations into our collective intent, because we think we can grow from that. That seems to me as the kind of sort of diversity and inclusion efforts that have a lot of tailwind, right? Are you going to have friction if you've defined the intent of bringing in different traditions, bringing in different accumulated shared learning in order to get to a specific point, on your roadmap. So I guess to me, it's DE&I. Well, by the way, I always am less comfortable talking about equity, because that's that's to me is a harder topic, and it often ends up being just a financial topic. I mean, the whole idea of March 15th being the day that a woman needs to work through the year past January 1st, all the way to March 15th, in order to be making as much money as the equivalent male, that strikes me as that's an equity problem that's still broken, and we have lots to do to fix that. But the idea of creating cultural synergy through inclusiveness and diversity, that should be something that's motivating to everybody. But it's hard, and I will say that one of the things that Ed and I have focused on in the latest edition of the Corporate Culture Survival Guide, the third edition, is trying to separate the idea of the structure of culture from the practice of culture. And this, I'm going to show a prop here that comes from this little book that I had to read in college, and it's very dense and it's kind of hard to read. It's called Historical Metaphors and Mythical Realities by Marshall Solins, who was a prominent social anthropologist in the 80s. And he talked about how culture has to be seen as this reciprocal movement between the practice of the structure, meaning how you adapt what has been done before, how you adapt what how did you say it, Scott? How we do things around here?
Mhm.
So there's the practice of the structure and the structure of the practice, which is, are you intentionally changing the way you do things in setting out different intentions? So in other words, structure and practice, the analogy is conventions and intentions. And so continuing or looking at culture as this continuous reciprocal movement of structure and practice, and recognizing that in the original Ed's 3-layer model, artifacts are more a reflection of the structure, whereas the way people talk to each other and relate to each other is a reflection of practice, and we call that the social culture, or our strategy, our specific goals and intentions with our business is part of our technical culture. And so at any rate, thinking about DE&I with intention, not just we're gonna recruit people of different races and gender associations and gender backgrounds. No, we have a specific intention to create cultural synergy by the people that we hire. So I'll leave it at that. It's probably going to draw some questions. So,
well, just a footnote that I think the other important point that is sort of has to be hammered home over and over again, because you as consultants have to hammer this home with your clients, is you do not start with culture change. You start with a organizational problem. Why are you doing anything at all? Why not just be a steward and let things work the way they are? And they say, oh, but we have a culture problem. I immediately say, define that for me. What are you talking about? Well, we don't have enough engagement. Oh, you have an engagement problem. Why is that a problem? Because we're losing our best people. Oh, and why is that a problem? Because our product development is suffering from losing the best engineers. All right, let's work how to get better products through rehiring the kinds of engineers. And then we ask, now, will our existing history, our existing how we do things, will that help us or hinder us? So the culture comes into play when we have been very, very clear about what our business or organizational problem really is. And only then is it really useful to talk about culture. Otherwise, we're talking about some abstraction that may or may not have anything to do with the reality of how this organization works.
the other just quick footnote on that, Scott, is what in some of our consulting work over the last few years, one of the first things we do is we say, let's stop using the word.
Stop
Don't
using
use
the word
culture. Be specific. Are we talking about something in our immediate past that created turmoil? Well, you could argue that's culture, but what is it? Or are we talking about how we, behave poorly in certain situations? We have bad meeting etiquette. okay, so that's a practice, and it's a part of our social culture. But try to use the vocabulary in order to be more specific, because to say we have a culture problem is just, it's not specific enough. Well, we have a revenue problem too, but you know, you have very specific ways of solving a revenue problem, or a profitability problem. Well, the same should apply with culture.
Well, the other thing that Peter brought into this pair, which I had not been as clear about, is that there is in the executive suite a technical culture called strategy and assumptions about products and services, that it's very easy for people inside the organization to lump culture into just the social culture of how we do things around here, and forget that when Ciba-Geigy said we've got to become a pharma company and get rid of all our chemical industries, that was a cultural decisions in their technical culture, because they had been completely assuming that the chemical products will be enough to survive, to help the organization to exist, and not to have to go completely into the pharma business, which they did eventually by becoming Novartis and so on. So this idea that culture is down in the trenches, in the social stuff, and it's being driven by strategy, is utter nonsense. The people who are driving the strategy are victims of their own technical culture that they have evolved over their own history. And that's why occasionally you bring in Gerstner or Carly Fiorina, or even more extremely, a manager to really totally disrupt the organization from the outside. That happens because the board realizes that at the corporate level, we're stuck in a technical culture that we're blind to seeing how stuck we are. And so disruption is often a disruption of the technical culture assumptions that the executive suite has been living with for too long.
You know, when I think about organizations that I'm familiar with that talk about their culture and wish it were different, I think about things like very technical cultures where they want people to value different skills other than analytic engineering skills. They want people skills or other skills to be more valued, or they want people to not defer to authority so much. They want to have a culture where people can disagree more openly, or they want a culture where you don't have to look and act like the older white men in the upper levels of management to get ahead in the culture. They want a more inclusive culture. So when you hear things like that, what would you advise leadership to do to
The first thing I would do is to say, why do you want to do that?
Well,
I wouldn't give them any advice. I'd say, why do you want to do that?
To answer your question, sometimes I'll hear there's a business reason for that, but more often it's like a gut feeling. Like people just feel this isn't the culture that's the way it should be.
Tell me about your gut feeling.
Well,
I'm not going to fall for that advice thing. I'm going to probe and probe and probe until we get to something workable. Because otherwise they want me to tell them how to attach some kind of social stuff to something that they don't understand and hope for the best. You can't change culture by importing a different managerial style. If that's really what's involved, they want to be less command and control, and they want to be more participative or whatever, that has to start with their own behavior. And I would probe until I said, well, what do you do on a day-to-day basis with your immediate reports? Tell me about it. Tell me how you make them feel more engaged. And before long, you're really beginning to give them the insights they're going to need to make any substantive change. Whereas if you tell them to, well, there's some good surveys that'll tell you, you know, what to do next, or hire some company that purports to create guaranteed proven engagement programs. They're going to do that, or you spend a ton of money and nothing will change. That's what the third edition of the Corporate Culture Survival Guide book really hammers at this. Don't get seduced by wanting to make what sounds like great necessary changes. Everybody wants it, it'll be better, it's morally proper. That may be valid, but not until you probed what the connection is in that client's head between what they want to see and the actual problem that they're living with. What's bothering them? I like the question, what's worrying you? Why are you worried about this? Before I go into any form of advice.
And
Which
Scott, I
means-
think
Go
it's
ahead.
right though to be very respectful of gut feelings. I mean,
Yeah.
that's one of those basic ideas that you know, Ed has told stories over the years of you know, you can tell in 5 minutes what's going on. Well, I mean, you can't document it, but you can tell, you know, with a vague sense of things not going quite right, just in very subtle cues. Humans are very good at seeing stuff like that, seeing, hearing, feeling. And so, you know, one of the sort of the things that we're getting at here is that it's about, you know, honoring those interpretations. And do we get then trapped and say, well, I think this is going on, so I really need to do a survey so that I can prove it with, you know, some degree of statistical significance. And you could get there, you could do that, and you probably could prove it. But, you know, by then it may have already changed. And, you know, and then you're going to start some sort of a change program. Start the change program the minute you have that feeling and see what happens. It's you know, the other thing that we talk a lot about in the Corporate Culture Survival Guide is the idea that we've tended to sort of set goals around you know, linear steps. We're going to do this and this and this and this and this, and you know, we tell a little story about how you could look at a change in terms of like a Kotter model, the 8-step Kotter model. But you might discover at the end that the change was only 20% successful. Does that mean 20% successful or 80% failure? And so often that gets looked at as 80% failure, not, oh, we did change some things, and if we keep iterating, we'll improve. And you know, change happens, you know, gradually and iteratively. It does not happen in a linear I mean, it can, but that might be random. Generally, you know, humans don't change, you know, in a linear way. You know, we change, you know, we oscillate back and forth.
Well, if you'd be willing to do this, let me ask for two examples. One example of a change that you observed and that you were involved in that just went exceptionally well. And then one example of a change that did not go well, something where there may have been a sincere intention to make a major change in an organization, and no matter what you tried, it just didn't work.
Well, then no matter what you tried is a difficult footnote.
Well, I'll just, Scott, I'll tell the quick story of when I was at Sun. You know, the business was changing, you know, times were getting hard. And Sun had a office culture. People had doors. And this was at a time when, you know, the open tables, you know, vast open spaces just with tables and workstations was sort of becoming a thing in Silicon Valley, and Sun had all these offices. And the story that we tell in the book is, though I don't think I name it as Sun in the book, so you know, cone of silence, everybody. But it's a long time ago. So, but the idea was we've got 1.4 offices per employee, and we have to go to 0.9 offices per employee. So how are we going to do that? So there was all sorts of great, you know, really, really good technical planning and technical implementation about how to do that. It did, you know, you know, I guess technically in our technical culture, you could say that we did succeed in doing that. Maybe not from exactly 1.4 to exactly 0.9, but freed up a lot of real estate, you know, solved a financial issue. And it had a pretty profound impact on the social culture. And so you could argue that it was a successful change in the technical culture, but it might have had a sort of, you know, deleterious effect on the social culture. One person later said to me, you know, I think that's what destroyed Sun. I think that's a little much. I think it changed the way people related to each other. And then the other thing was that how you measure the change was completely dependent on what part of the organization you were in. Because if you were in a you know, sales marketing or a kind of customer facing role, you might have changed the way people work together in one respect. If you're in engineering, you might not have changed at all because they came up with ways to basically get around the technical changes in order to keep behaving the way they used to behave. And if you're engineering at a company like Sun, you get to do what you want to do because it's the lifeblood of the company. So, you know, I guess the point is how you measure that success. You know, it's not as critical to say it's successful or not successful. It's like, you know, you change things, and you know that in some respects it worked, it was good, it was positive. In other respects, that change might not be what you wanted to create. And so then do you have to come up with ways of iterating back so that you don't lose something because you created this big change. So, Ed?
An example that occurs to me that's sort of ongoing, and I think what maybe I left out of my rant, is that the importance of involving the most senior people you can get a handle on at this level of confronting them with what are they really, really trying to do, or what's really worrying them. When you have sort of the attention of the very senior people, things become much clearer. So the example that occurs to me is we ran into a healthcare system where the CEO and the COO fell in love for whatever reasons with the book Humble Inquiry. They thought that, really asking each other questions and becoming less of a dictator teller and more of an inquirer was very important in their organization. So they launched a series of exercises to a selected group of the next layer in the organization to learn how to be better at question asking instead of always be telling, and created something of a reward system so that that group will begin to create exercises for the people below them to institute this humble idea of a different way of talking to each other. But when you say, why are they so concerned about that? In the end, it's because they realize that how we talk to each other totally influences the quality of our medicine. I mean, the deeper reason is the strategic issue of we want to be better at every level of talking to our patients, talking to each other. And so you could say, well, they could just call that a culture change, and it is, but that loses the emphasis that what they're really trying to do is to learn how to communicate better with each other. And at that level, it makes total sense. And then they discover that they have cultural elements already in the system that make it easier to do that, because medicine already has do no harm and a lot of positive values onto which they can attach this new set of behaviors that they want to institute. So I think what I'm hearing is, both from Peter's and my own example, is that I don't think we have complete stories. I think it's always a complex, dynamic, iterative process of things happening that both influence at the technical level how the organization is performing, and at the social level how people feel about life in that organization. And the trick is to integrate those and not to just work one without the other. So to say, let's have everybody be psychologically safe, that's now a big deal, right? So we'll have a huge psychological safety program, while at the same time the reward system is labeled by everyone a blame culture. The way we judge performance is by when things go well, who's the hero? And when things don't go well, who do we punish? 5% always have to be gotten out of the system. No matter how much you emphasize psychological safety in that culture, if it's developed as a blame culture, they won't get anywhere until they tackle their reward system. And that's often what they're least willing to do, is to stop blaming individuals and begin to look at the systemic reasons why things work or don't work, and then begin slowly to examine how that poisons the social culture and how they won't get the right kind of open safety kind of culture until the reward system intrinsically encourages that from the very top on down. Does that make sense?
It makes total sense theoretically. So let me follow this up with a practical question, which is, have you ever had an experience where a client really got that and changed the reward system?
Well, I could give you examples in the nuclear industry where I consulted for a while with INPO, which was the big internal consulting consortium that worked with 100 or so nuclear plants. they illustrated several key points. The people from INPO who went into a plant tell the story that Peter referred to. Within 5 minutes, they could tell whether this is an autocratic plant where the employee does not feel safe telling the manager that this valve is on its last legs. We've got to do something. It's unsafe. So then I would say to this INPO member, well, do you get that across to them? And they say, no, they won't hear it. We see it, but they won't hear it. It takes us 2 weeks of documenting in great detail all the things that are wrong in that plant, of which this may be one key event. And then we have our senior people talking to the plant manager or the site manager and doing a heavy-handed, can you see with all these things we've shown you that you have a problem in your plant? And then sometimes, not always, those site managers say, oh, I see in the data what you're talking about. So what should we do? Now you finally have the attention where you need it. And then the site manager or the CEO says, all right, I think we're going to have to, in plant X, where you're showing me these data, we're going to start an improvement program that will address how we talk to each other about problems and how we begin to open up the trust level. Because every definition of safety culture talks about trust. And trust is the thing that's most often missing. But trust starts at the very top. And so then these plants will often make a year or 2 year long program. And then at the annual meeting, they'll get awards and prizes for actually having changed their whole reward structure, and they'll call it a culture change. And to a great degree, it really is a culture change. But we didn't start it that way. We started it with the top people seeing the problem and saying, oh my God, yes, I really do have to do something here. And then saying, now, how do I proceed? And listening, maybe at that point, some advice might be heard, but only when they've been convinced that they have a business problem. It always seems to go back to that. If I'm not worried that my company is unsafe or not doing something well, I'm just not going to pay attention. At least that's been my experience. The hardest thing to break into is the executive suite, in my experience.
I would add, Scott, something at a completely different level. I'm curious if people have had experiences with hackathons and sort of, change programs that are managed at an agile speed, because there is something about that, and often, like with a hackathon to create something or to change something might end up having a some sort of incentive or reward at the end. But I'd like to think that the real benefit of those things is that the idea of the hackathon, where it's a day or two, that intense time frame will tend to sort of not eliminate, but will sort of diffuse some of the hierarchical thinking that would otherwise exist, right? I've got a day and I'm working with people in the organization that I haven't worked with, and we're trying to figure something out. And all of a sudden the hierarchy is kind of set aside. So maybe I start to develop relationships with these people and I feel very safe with them. even if one of them's a VP in another division and I'm just a product manager. And so in other words, the incentive to that might be, well, wow, you guys created something really interesting and new, or you figured out a way that we can save, 2% on, the operating cost of that widget. But maybe what's more important is that out of that hackathon, we change the way we start to relate with people across some of these silo boundaries and hierarchical levels. So the incentivized change, the incentive may be less important than what people learn in going after that incentive.
I have a great example of something like that. That's a little different, but it's related. I was just part of a doctoral committee at a PsyD event where the dissertation was that a school of nursing decided in its wisdom, and I don't know how they arrived at this, but they decided that they would have a 1.5-day workshop on introducing arts thinking to their faculty. And the top people mandated that all 120 or so nursing professors and at every level had to attend this. They hired an organization that is known for doing these workshops. And I just listened to the dissertation summary of what happened. They started by having people do upside down drawings. And then they started having them build collages by cutting up paper. And they put this in very short time slots. You only have 5 minutes to do this up, and then you have only 5 minutes. And they do this in groups. And the impact on the organization was incredible. People got to know each other. They thought this was a lot of dumb stuff, but it's because it was a lot of dumb stuff, it equated the status hierarchy. We're all equally dumb at drawing an upside down drawing, or building a collage with cut up paper, or doing all this artsy, crafty stuff. So this was not a hackathon, but this 1.5 days totally changed all their relationships with each other. And it was really amazing how much this playfulness and shifting everyone into a completely different way of encountering each other had this impact. Now, it had to be mandated. A lot of people resented having to give up their other meetings so that they could attend this workshop. But someone at the sponsorship level had come to believe that we need to shake this system up in a way that will reveal to people that there's a better way that they can relate to each other. And that seemed to be the impact. So I think maybe there are a lot of things like this that can be done in organizations if you can get people to do them.
Well, speaking of putting people in small groups and getting them talking with each other, this might be a good time for us to do this here. Giuseppe, maybe if you could put people into groups of about 3 or 4, and we could talk about, in each group, talk about what was stimulated in terms of organizational culture, organizational change, and anything else you might want to pose to Ed and Peter Schein. So, Giuseppe, can we get into breakout groups?
Not a problem. How long would you like to go in for?
15 minutes, maybe? How does that sound? Okay.
Try dialogue.
Now that people are back from breakout rooms, maybe any breakout room that wants to pose any question or offer any observation for Ed and Peter to comment on, feel free to put something in the chat. And while you're doing that, Ed was talking about Lego, how Lego executives broaden their perspective. So do you want to say a few more words about that while people are typing?
Well, more important than Lego is that there's a number of business schools that start this process of broadening with their own students. So, for example, this school in Bled, Slovenia, which is one of the important business schools in the sort of Eastern Europe bloc, this woman, Danica Perg, has made it a practice to have resident artists, either piano or painters, who regularly interact with the students, encourage student participation in the arts, and make thinking like an artist part of your education. Because thinking like an artist means, you know, seeing things more deeply, more broadly, allowing your feelings to influence you. And so I've been in favor of that. We didn't do much of it at Sloan, but the emphasis at MIT on the arts overall is pretty great. We encourage students overall to be humanized, not just science and engineered. So that was the main point I wanted to highlight by this recent thesis, showing in a research sense how in an ongoing organization, how much this day and a half influenced this organization.
Also,
Yeah.
while people were in breakout rooms, we were talking about culture, and Peter was talking about the culture at Apple. So I'm curious, Peter, if you can say a little about that, and also presuming people have read the book Steve Jobs and its very vivid descriptions of Apple and the culture and the behaviors there, if you can comment on that.
And sort of back to where we started this conversation an hour or so ago, I can comment on the Apple that was the culture of Apple when I was there, but I was there in, you know, what I guess jokingly we have referred to as the interregnum, where John Sculley was the CEO, and then succeeded by Michael Spindler, and Steve Jobs was doing Next and Pixar. And so the Apple that we know today, you know, we could say that's the Steve Jobs Apple, but I wouldn't even say that. He passed away in 2013. So the Apple that we see today is the Tim Cook Apple. And I just think we always have to be aware that the culture changes, you know, as a sort of a filtering through of the conventions and intentions of the senior management team. Whether it's intentional changes or whether it's just they come about with different sets of assumptions. I'll give you sort of one example. The person who succeeded Michael Spindler was Gil Amelio, and he came from, I believe, National Semiconductor. So in two CEOs, you went from a you know, packaged goods, you know, Pepsi Frito guy, and John Sculley, to a semiconductor guy. And then Michael Spindler in between, he was a big systems guy. I think he was at DEC actually in Germany. before Apple. And so oh, then of course the other thing about Apple now is that it's so secretive, for good reason, that I feel like I could get a real sense of how it's different just by walking into the spaceship, as it were. It does look like a spaceship. But I could never walk in to the spaceship. That's not something you can do. I'd have to be escorted. I'd have to have, the escort with me at all times, and there are probably many parts of the campus that I wouldn't be allowed to go. That was not true when I was at Apple.
Really?
So, sure, Apple has always been very protective of its intellectual property, but there were so many incidents of, once the iPhone became this object of universal desire, there were so many cases of designs and prototypes and things like that being, stolen or left at a bar. And so I think Apple's security culture just changed dramatically since when I was there. And again, I could probably go through a litany of changes that again are reflecting that that sort of shared accumulated learning. So the company has learned things along the way that do kind of alter how it interacts with customers, how it interacts with ecosystems, and how it interacts with its own employees. One of the things that I worked on was doing wireless messaging for the Newton. Now, if anybody remembers the Newton, you now get a sense of how old I am. But I mean, this was something that was just by modern standards was so ridiculously simple and underpowered and pathetic. But that's just the way technology is, right? That's just Moore's law, basically. It's memory, it's microprocessing. I mean, the internet didn't exist either, or the internet did, but the World Wide Web and web services and apps and things like that did not exist. And the question that's always been to me is that people, even within Apple and people who work on the iPhone, will probably look back at that Newton and say, what a joke that was. But my response to that would be, you would never have gotten to the brilliance of the iPhone without all of the things that were wrong with the Newton. So anyway, Scott, that was a little bit of a random walk through Apple. I could go on for days, but I do think it's important to note that, and it would be a very interesting study, what dimensions of culture are still salient today that might have been salient in the sort of mid-late 90s. I'd love to know. I think it's probably very little, because again, shared accumulated learning, but what we learn and what's salient has a half-life. And again, that's part of that process of evolving or changing.
Well, from what I remember from reading Steve Jobs, it seemed like he had an outsized impact on the culture and on the company in every way. In that, yes, go ahead. Yeah.
I also had my day with Apple, because during that interregnum at a different time, they wanted me to analyze their culture. And I did talk to a lot of people and got a sense. And out of all that, I had two sort of insights. One is the founder story that you just alluded to. I don't think it's incidental that the story I heard was that when Wozniak and Jobs first got to know each other, the shared vision was that Wozniak wanted a very simple computer that the classrooms, that the kids could use. And that somehow this had something to do with the early Apples. And that Jobs had this crazy vision that he wanted what was called a toy for yuppies. At that time, they wouldn't sell to industry or the government. They were very ideological in the early years. But this idea of a toy for yuppies, that's what the iPhone is, you know? And I think there's something about technical entrepreneurs that sometimes their technical vision just survives. Because I also remember people telling me that the reason Scully basically failed is because he never got the respect of the technical part of Apple. They just never got him. And so he had to go. That the technical part of Apple was the real culture. And so this simplicity of use is at Tim Cook, you know. Brilliant marketing, brilliant stores. That he's a kind of a legacy of that vision of a toy for yuppies.
There's a great example of how, you know, this process of evolving culture can involve basically sort of decimating artifacts, right? You know, there are certain artifacts, there's certain things that we just say we have to get rid of that. That's the wrong way to think about who we are. The one that I love is that one of the things that the iPhone people thought was so stupid about the Newton was that it had a stylus. Like Samsung has their Note phone that has the stylus built in, and Newton was based around the stylus and handwriting recognition. Well, the handwriting recognition didn't work, and it became a great laughing matter. You know, one of the great jokes was if you wrote Scully, the Newton recognized it as Scaly. Now, of course, that was an Easter egg, but the handwriting recognition didn't work very well. And but the whole idea of the stylus and then the stylus became very popular in the Palm Pilot. That, you know, vastly outperformed the Newton because it was so much simpler. But Jobs looked at the stylus and just hated it. And he said, no, we're not. And then, you know, Samsung had their stylus. And so it just became a sacred cow. We're not doing a stylus. Yeah, but a few years later, you know, you can get a really nice stylus with your iPad, right? It's because Apple's recognizing, well, there's a lot of creatives who buy our products who want that device, who want that stylus. So they bury that artifact, they bury that sacred cow and move on. And, you know, again, that's a sort of a simple artifact example, but there's something to that, you know, Apple finds a way to sort of continue to recreate itself if they find a good reason to do it. And the stylus or the Apple Pencil is a good example of why there was a good reason to do it.
Okay, thank you. Why don't we shift for a moment? And Giuseppe, do you want to read a couple of questions from the chat?
Sure. There's a lot of dialogue going on in the chat around the impacts of COVID. How does culture show up in a hybrid model? Everyone's sharing their thoughts. What are your thoughts?
Well, a simple answer is if culture is learned behavior, what have we seen in the COVID years has been learned. And what I've seen, to make it brief, is how people who never see each other face to face, nevertheless have learned to work together. Several of my grandchildren are in jobs that are entirely virtual, with teams that are entirely virtual, with bosses that are entirely virtual, and they claim that it's working just fine. So cultural forms will evolve in the virtual world, but they will look different. But they'll again be based on how we learn to work together to get done whatever it is we're trying to get done. That's one part of my answer.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the pulling back, there's that sort of that hand wringing. Is our organizational culture going to be destroyed by the fact that we're all working from home? And I guess I would argue, if anything, maybe it's being enhanced. Again, if it's a permanent condition, that my response comes with a qualification. But think about the way, in some respects, that we have been able to relate to each other in a different way because we're on Zoom. That has to be net positive. We learn something there that's positive. Now, granted, we're all gonna want to be together in the same three-dimensional space at some point, but I really think that the idea that our culture gets eroded by work from home or by lockdown, I think that's not. I don't think that's true. I think it gets added to and maybe changed. Do we really, because we used to really love to have our pizza Wednesdays, because all of a sudden we're not doing that, does that mean that we no longer love our pizza Wednesdays? I mean, that might still be a very positive part of our work experience, but we'll get back to it. In the meantime, we've come up with ways of finding things that make us happy at work through Zoom. I just think it's a net positive. Yeah.
Let me throw out a different point of view that I sometimes hear, especially from tech companies, and get your reactions to that. I find a number of people say what's missing are the random bumping into each other and water cooler conversations and the meeting before the meeting or the meeting after the meeting. And as opposed to this group, which deliberately has a wellness moment and deliberately has breakout rooms where people are encouraged to talk with each other. That's something that less sophisticated leaders often neglect, or they don't know how to stimulate the informal, less structured ways that people get together. And sometimes the response to that is to force people to come to the office, or force people to come to the office on certain days so that that's not lost. So any thoughts you might have on that?
Peter, are you going to tell the Sun story of how the engineering groups found a way to talk to each other?
Yeah, but I think that's a little complicated. So I think I might let's hold that one. I kind of alluded to it earlier that since the engineering culture was a little bit different than a lot of the sort of sales, admin, corporate functions, engineering found a way around the processes that have been imposed by what was essentially the facilities and accounting people. But Scott, to your question, I think I think it's absolutely true that sort of spontaneous effectiveness of people bumping into each other and coming up with new ideas or challenging each other in positive ways. Yeah, all virtual tends to erode that. At the same time, there were many things that I think people loved about working this way. And so that's why it really was striking to me that there was sort of that bright line between companies that said, nope, we're going back to work. And companies have said, of course, the future is hybrid. We've created this way of interacting. We're not just going to kill it, because there are people who love it. There are things that are great about it. But of course, at the same time, we create all of these funny dysfunctions, like the story that's very common of the person who's got, 9 one-hour Zooms in a row with no breaks. Because, well, the calendaring system will allow us to do that. So then, somebody's busy and that you never did that when you were in the office, but somehow we end up sort of using the tool and then blowing it. But so I do think that's why, how could you not go back to some sort of a hybrid model? Or maybe the response is, well, we're all going back to the office. And if you really liked that hybrid or that virtual thing so much, then leave. Because we're not that culture. We're not, well, that's a bad use of culture. We're not designed for that. We're an in the office place, and you should come into the office. And I think there are probably some people who along the way, maybe that's part of the quiet quitting thing, or the great resignation, really didn't want to go back to the office. For a lot of people, there was a safety issue. It's not safe to go back in the office. COVID is by no means over. Anyway.
Well, wouldn't we say that the internet and the social media have had a bigger impact than COVID by making all this possible? And that has changed the generational value systems. So my take on this is I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm going to watch carefully what my grandchildren are actually doing. And how are they dealing with what they're experiencing, which may be too little or too much being away from each other? How are they coping? Because I think what they're going to do is going to override what we as theoreticians might invent. They're going to do what they're going to do, the 20 and 30-year-olds and the generation coming after them, because the world is such a different place. It's all interconnected. It's got huge problems politically, wars and global warming. To me, those are bigger issues than whether we work at home or in the office, that this new generation is have to deal with. So I watch my grandchildren and watch what they do.
That just opens up a whole new set of issues. The world today, especially these last few years, is so different than it was before. There's more obvious racism and bigotry. There are more environmental threats. There are wars. There's pandemic. There's polarization, and this just opens up a whole host of questions. Before you respond to that, Giuseppe, do you want to put in the chat maybe a couple of their recent books if people want to explore this more?
Let me grab the links. I will drop them in.
If humble leadership is one of them, I should note that we're revising it. So next summer, there's going to be a completely different take on humble leadership.
So then you'll be
humble
telling
inquiry
people to-
has just been revised.
What?
Humble inquiry has just been revised and co-authored the new edition.
I have to ask you a question. How do you stay so vibrant and so active in this field? You know, as someone who's published some of the most important works in our field, and that then the two of you keep on writing together. How do you do that?
My answer to that is simple. I'm stimulated by Peter to do this. It's a whole new ballgame for me, is to have a co-author who's creative and vital. So I'm hugely stimulated by our process.
And you know, I think the sort of important family history part of it is that we've always been close and we've always talked. If you know, if we hadn't been, if I was completely off in my own world and then came back, to be able to sort of get some ideas together and start writing together probably would have been much harder. But we were always we always kind of had a meta going on, even though technically what we were working on was completely different. But also there were all along the way, there were some interesting touch points. We did, you know, work with different people at Apple at the same time. But we've been comparing notes for a long time. And I think that made the writing easier. Yeah.
It's hugely stimulating to have a co-author, because most of my earlier work was me sitting down and writing down what I observed. These last 4 or 5 books are a different ballgame, how our two ideas come together in today's world. Where I was more of a structuralist, I think I've turned into more of a practitioner. And that's very stimulating.
I just have to comment, it's funny to see Career Anchors Reimagined. The link to Amazon, that's not coming out for a while. But Amazon, you know, they're bending time and space continually. So I wish people could have that in their hands soon and let us know what they think, but that one's going to be a while. We're still correcting page proofs.
So if you had to pick, which do you consider the best thing you've ever written, both you guys have ever written and any other work in our field that other authors have written, what would you pick?
Well, I can't deal with a question, because what I realize about myself is that I have been a creative opportunist and have made contributions in different fields as opportunities arose. But if you keep pressing me, the book that I think had the most of me in it at the time was that little book called Helping. Helping was written at a time shortly after my wife had died, and I was in a sort of a retirement. And when I look at all my years at MIT, I learned from being a formal research-oriented academic to becoming a helper. And so in that little helping book, I pulled together all the process consultation stuff and put it in one place. I still like that book. It did not become a bestseller, but that's the book I feel was most me in retrospect.
You got some votes, Ed, in the chat, reinforcing that.
For helping?
Yeah.
Good.
And Scott, I think the one that I mean, I really love the Corporate Culture Survival Guide because in some respects it's the most cumulative of all of Ed's and then my culture books. Unfortunately, it has a horrible title, and and Wiley wouldn't really let us change it. We wanted to call it Culture Change Leadership, which we do sort of on the, on the jacket cover. But, it just is funny because, the 90s are calling and they want their book title back. Nobody refers to corporate culture anymore, do they? I don't think so. But because it was a third edition, we had to kind of keep the title. And but really what that book is about is sort of all of Ed's experience and some new ideas that we came up with together around culture change and leadership. And Ed, there's somebody who loves process consultation.
Well, that was the early version, right? But I guess the real issue is I didn't start there. What I didn't say in the history of how I got there is the enormous impact of the decision to go to work in a management school and then have my mentor, Doug McGregor, send me off to an NTL group. I think that was a metamorphosis for me from being a pure researcher professor to gradually shifting into being a consultant helper practitioner over the years. The T group was a major influence, and I hope all of you have been through a T group. If you haven't been through a T group, you shouldn't be out there consulting.
What did you get out of it?
The knowledge of how the world is a set of relational processes, and that those processes are visible and analyzable and manageable. It's the whole process focus, the here and now, the situational. Everything can be analyzed situationally.
Ed and I sort of conceived of this partnership in November, December of 15, I guess, but he said he wouldn't do it if I didn't go do a T group. And so in February of the following year, I did the 3.5-day NTL T group, Human Interaction Lab, it's called, but went back to the source, to NTL, and it was good, but it also is, Ed, when I told Ed all about the 3.5 days, he was sort of alarmed because it has had to sort of move with the market, and the market wants a certain program that will, be very kind of specific in what it teaches people. And that's not exactly what the original T group idea was supposed to be about. It wasn't supposed to be that programmatic.
Well, that leads to a final point, and I think we're now getting to a point where we have to close up. And that is that the T group also taught me, through having the design workshops and actually running them for many years, what groups are all about. and how complicated group dynamics really are. And I think OD is lacking in good theories and good practices of group dynamics and how to run meetings and what really goes on in relationships and groups. So our current emphasis that we're writing more and more about is levels of relationships and teaching people about simple stuff in group dynamics that still is not practiced very well in most organizations. Most meetings are still a disaster, and executives don't even have any idea that meetings are complicated constructions that can be managed better. Dialogue being one version of such a variation that I'm quite strong about. I like this new emphasis on dialogic OD that Marshak and Bush are pushing, because it's an open systems model that emphasizes how complicated life really is and how we have to not just sell tools, but help people to figure out what they're really doing. Help them be more intentional and overcome some of the conventions.
What a wonderful note to end on. I just want to thank you on behalf of all of us from the bottom of our hearts that this was just a wonderful evening. You've covered so many broad topics that go back to the early roots of the field as well as what's happening in the current day. And you touched on so many things, and this was really an inspirational evening. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you.
Enjoyed it thoroughly.
Great discussion.